Okay, good morning, everybody. I know it's early, but it's also late. We're past the time this panel is scheduled to begin. So thank you all for coming. And before we start with the panel, let me just mention that there's a lot of material on the front table about the efforts to free the Cuban Five, about the campaign, about the case. So please take material. There are buttons, postcards, and other information, and it's all very, very useful. This is a complex case with many layers. So I hope that we're able to have time for the presentation and for some discussion at the end of it. My name is Nalda Bajetsi. I am a coordinator of the National Network on Cuba. The National Network on Cuba is the umbrella organization for many groups throughout the United States who do work in solidarity with Cuba and with respect for Cuban sovereignty. So enough of that. Our first presenter this morning is Michael Smith, who is also doing another panel tomorrow, and there's a flyer on that. Michael Smith and Michael Ratner are colleagues at the Center for Constitutional Rights, and Michael has just published a book on killing Che, and he is going to start the program with an overview of the CIA mission vis-a-vis other countries. Michael?
Yeah. Thanks, Nalda. And Jose and Alejandro, welcome. Stan, where are you?
Here.
Thanks for setting this up. And welcome all you Irish supporters of the Cuban Revolution, particularly Leonardo. I have a feeling that a lot of you people know a lot about Cuba. Is that right?
Yes.
Is there anybody here who will identify themselves as someone who doesn't know that much about Cuba? Anybody?
Good.
Okay. You want to come closer? I just wanted to remember Len Weinglass. It's the week he died a year ago. He was the attorney for the Cuban Five and a friend of a lot of ours. And in fact, the book that Ratner and I did, Who Killed Che, How the CIA Got Away with Murder, is dedicated to Len. I think that a good subtitle to this panel would have been The Unforgivable Revolution. I think I spelled unforgivable wrong, which in itself is unforgivable. But that's what we're talking about here. With the assassination of Che, and I use assassination intentionally, assassination is a political murder. And Che was assassinated by the United States government, particularly the CIA, with the cooperation of its Bolivian client state under a military dictator they had recently put in power named Barrientos. Che was trying to defend the Cuban Revolution by extending it to other countries in Latin America. The Cuban Five were trying to defend the Cuban Revolution by identifying the terrorists in Miami that were killing people and destroying property in Havana. Jose Posada Carriles was an instrument of the CIA, a CIA agent, and one of the really mass murderers of the 20th century who goes free because of his connections to the CIA. So what we're really talking about today is the Cuban Revolution. And when I say revolution, I mean social revolution. The term is used too loosely in this country. The Egyptians did not have a revolution. They replaced one head military guy with a whole bunch of military guys. That's not a social revolution. The Cubans did something different, and they took for themselves, which was their right, their own property. And since 1959, the United States has been trying to get it back. And that's what we're talking about with the assassination of Che, with the freeing of Posada Carriles, with the jailing of the Cuban Five. What we're talking about is the unforgivable revolution, where the United States wants to get back what it lost in 1959. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little bit about Che personally and what he was trying to do and what the United States did to him and why. Che would have been 84 years old this year. He was born in 1928. He was killed in 1967. Che was born to an offbeat, aristocratic Argentinian family. His mother was 3 months pregnant when they got married in 1928. It was a scandal. The family had more blue blood than money. Che grew up in a bohemian household. He was the oldest of 5 children. The children would ride their bikes in the front door, through the living room and out the back door. There were no fixed meal times. Friends and relatives came over at all times to drink and smoke, drink red wine. There were books laid out in magazines all over the house. They talked politics. Che's parents were anti-clerical. They were active in the fight against Franco. Che organized a soccer team when he was a kid with neighborhood kids. His entire team was made up of atheists. The other teams were invariably bigger and therefore usually won. Che was largely homeschooled because he had asthma, but he read voraciously. He read his father's entire 25-volume history of the modern world. He read Bertrand Russell, Sigmund Freud, Jules Verne. He read Mussolini. He read Stalin. He read Marx. He wanted to write a monograph about Marx. He read Lenin. He said he loved Lenin because Lenin ate, dreamed, and slept socialist revolution. Che rubbed shoulders. He got a job as a merchant mariner and sailed around and met all sorts of people on the merchant marine ships. He took that famous motorcycle trip. You remember the movie, The Motorcycle Diaries? And he went to Bolivia, where he saw the tin miners. He went to Chile, where he saw the copper miners. He wrote in his diary, because he had a habit of keeping a diary, that the Yankees have taken everything and left our people only an ox. When he came back from his motorcycle trip, he finished medical school. He passed 10 medical school exams in 10 weeks. And he went to Guatemala to get a job as a physician. His idea was that he wanted to be a research doctor and discover something that he could give for the benefit of humanity. He was in Guatemala for almost a year, never got a job as a physician. He worked as a photojournalist. He got married there to Hilda Gadea. They had a child later on. She was much more political than he was, which is often the case with relationships, and he learned from her. He was there while Arbenz was the president of Guatemala, and this is important because Arbenz made the mistake of nationalizing fallow land that was unused, that was owned by the United Fruit Company. And as a consequence, the CIA organized a coup. They got a guy named Castillo Armas, who was a retired colonel in the army and was selling used furniture at the time. And they got Armas and they set him up in Nicaragua and they trained him. Nicaragua was hospitable to the whole enterprise because it was run by Somoza's son. Roosevelt said about Somoza that he was a bastard, but he was our bastard. And so was the son. And they allowed Armas to organize a mercenary army, come into Guatemala, overthrow Arbenz, overturn the nationalizations of the land that was given to the peasants. Che resisted that unsuccessfully, took refuge in the Argentinian embassy, and then went to Mexico City. In Mexico City, he met up with a guy that he had met in Guatemala named Nico Lopez. Lopez was a veteran of the Moncada attack, where Moncada is like the second largest barracks in Cuba. And the students were trying to capture it. They didn't succeed. Many were killed. Lopez went into exile. Fidel was sent to prison. The dictator Batista in Cuba made the mistake of letting Fidel out. And he met Lopez, and Lopez said, "I want you to meet Fidel. He's coming to Mexico City." Che and Fidel went out for dinner. Che reports there was an instant sympathy between them, that he thought that Fidel was very self-confident, and that when he said he was going to go back to Cuba to fight, he would get to Cuba, and when he said he was going to fight, that he would win, and that they would overthrow the Batista dictatorship. So Fidel asked Che to sign on to the mission. Che said, "Yes, I'll do it, but with the proviso that for reasons of state, you don't keep me in Cuba. And when I want to leave to do other political missions, you'll let me go." And Fidel said yes. Che was the third person to sign on. Raul was the second. Che signed on as the troop doctor. Fidel had raised the money to buy a little cabin cruiser called the Grandma. He bought it from a Texas guy that owned this the whole ship could fit into this room. And they bought it. It was called Grandma because it was named after the Texans' grandmother. And 82 people got on it, and they sailed across to Cuba. They landed in Cuba in the wrong place, a day late. They were attacked by Batista, who was forewarned they were coming. They landed in a mangrove swamp, which is very hard to walk through. They were all under fire. Che escaped. He grabbed his ammunition bag instead of his medical bag, and he became one of the military leaders of the Cuban Revolution. I just got a sign that I have 12 minutes left, so I'm going to fast forward. The battle that won the Cuban Revolution was the Battle of Santa Clara, where Camilo Cienfuegos and Che, leading the troops, captured the city of Santa Clara and a big munitions supply that was on a train. They cut the island in half. Batista went to the Dominican Republic, and the Cuban Revolution began. Three laws were immediately passed. One was to lower the age so that Fidel could be the prime minister. He was 33. The second was to make Che a citizen because he was Argentinian. The third was the Great Land Reform Act. And it was a law that Che helped write, and it was a law that they learned from the Guatemala experience, that you have to give these huge land estates, mostly owned by the United States, to the people who actually work them, who were poor peasantry in Cuba. And you have to arm these people so they can keep what they have. And you have to disperse the old ruling class, or they're going to come back and bite you. And they did that. Che served the Cuban Revolution in many capacities for 6 years. And then he went to Bolivia. And I want to finish the second half of my talk on what he was trying to do in Bolivia and what the United States did in response. Che, with Fidel's total support, thought that they might be able to get a toehold in Bolivia. Why? Because Bolivia was the most unstable government in all of Latin America. It had had 189 changes in government since 1825. The most recent being when the United States organized a military dictatorship and overthrew the democratic government of Paz Encensoro because Paz refused to isolate Cuba. The United States was on a successful effort to almost totally isolate Cuba. They got every country in Latin America and the Caribbean to cut off relations with Cuba. Every country except Mexico. But Mexico had its own independent tradition and wouldn't do it. But every other country cut off relations with Cuba. Che was trying to break out of that. The embargo against Cuba, the economic embargo, was installed 50 years ago this year. He was trying to break out of that. And he thought that if he went to Bolivia, this really unstable, weak military dictatorship, they could take power in Bolivia, and they could make the spine of the Andes like the Sierra Maestra Mountains were to the Cuban Revolution, and that the revolution could spread in Latin America, to Chile, to Argentina, to Bolivia, to Uruguay, that they would get a toehold in Bolivia and then spread it out in all directions. And that was what Che was trying to do. The United States, in the meantime, had the CIA, which by 1948 was really a paramilitary organization. It practiced assassinations. They had a doctrine of plausible deniability, a practice really, where they would do it, but they would do it secretly. And they wouldn't tell the president what they were doing. The president would give them a broad outline of what he wanted done, and then the CIA would do it. But they wouldn't tell the president why, because they, according to Richard Helms, who was organizing things in those days, we didn't want to embarrass the president by telling him exactly what we're doing. But by 1967, when they succeeded in killing Che, they had killed or tried to kill 18 different heads of state around the world. And it's all documented in killing Che. But I only have a few more minutes, so let me get to the point of what happened to Che. Che was in Bolivia for 11 months. His intent was to consolidate and train the troops he was with and then move north to a more hospitable area and begin the guerrilla struggle. He never got there. His presence was discovered in March, the presence of the guerrillas. The head of the army ran over to the American ambassador's home in La Paz and begged him for napalm and tanks and airplanes. And the American ambassador said, "Cool it, we don't want to overreact here. We'll help you, but let's do it in a more measured way or we're going to get a counterproductive problem." So what they did was they got the head of the Southern Command, a general named Tope, flew into Bolivia. They signed a contract. We got it in the documents in this book. They signed a contract where the United States would supply everything from bullets for breakfast to the Bolivian army. They would train the army. They would provide intelligence for the army. All the Bolivians had to do was supply the men and the land, and the United States would do everything else. So they started training the Bolivian army to encircle and capture the Che guerrilla band. The Bolivian army had no intelligence because it was recently established. It had been overthrown in '52, and they had no intelligence. The CIA provided the intelligence. They sent in two people. One was Gustavo Belaldo, the other was Felix Rodriguez, who you've probably heard of. Belaldo was the son of a very rich man in Cuba. He owned the GM distributorship and a 100,000-acre farm. And the reason you see all the Chevrolets in Havana is probably because of Belaldo's father. In any case, Belaldo, and this is documented in the book also, Belaldo was sent by the CIA to La Paz, took his limo to the presidential palace, and he said to Barrientos, "We want Che killed. We want your word that if you capture him, you'll kill him." Barrientos replied, "I give you my word as the president of Bolivia that if we capture Che, we will kill him." We also have a document in our book written on White House stationery by Walt Whitman Rostow, who was the head of, like, they had this counter-revolutionary team of military intelligence people that had an office in the White House. And Rostow was part of the team. They brought him in from MIT. And Rostow, his brother was Eugene Victor Debs Rostow. His parents were radicals. He must have been a disappointment. And Rostow organized the American counter-revolutionary effort, not only in Cuba, but around the world. They monitored it. They reported directly to President Johnson. Rostow writes on White House stationery, "The troops that we supplied and trained in Bolivia, quote, finally got him. Che was captured. He was disarmed. He was wounded in the leg. He was taken," and I'm going to conclude with this, he was taken to a little village in Bolivia called La Higuera. And there he was put into a little mud schoolhouse, a one-room schoolhouse. Felix Rodriguez was there, dressed as a Bolivian army captain. Che realized right away that he was Cuban. Rodriguez tried to interrogate him. Che wouldn't be interrogated. Rodriguez got on his American shortwave radio. He cranked it up and he called La Paz. They had a prearranged code worked out. 05 meant Che, 06 meant save him, 07 meant kill him. He got the code back, 0507. He relayed the the order to the Bolivian captain who was there. The Bolivian captain chose a lieutenant to go kill Che in the room. The lieutenant went into the room. He couldn't do it and left. So then they got a sergeant. They drew straws. Sergeant Mario Terran drew the shortest straw. So he was sent into the room. And Che was sitting down. Che stood up, and Terran said, "Sit down." And Che said, "I will remain standing for this." Because he knew what was happening. Terran got cold feet and he left. Fortified himself with a couple of drinks of alcohol. Came back in. Che stood up. Terran closed his eyes and he sprayed bullets, shot Che across the chest. His lungs filled up with blood, and he was killed. And the last part of the story is this. Rodriguez and Villaldo then strapped Che's corpse onto the strut of an American helicopter, and they flew it to a hospital in a nearby town called Valle Grande. And there they put his body on a cement slab in the basement in the laundry room, and they called a press conference. And they had the press come in and view the body as a triumph. Backfired, but that's what they did. They then cut Che's hands off, and they sent his hands to Langley, Virginia, to identify the fingerprints. Because Langley had Che's fingerprints from 1952 when he was in Miami, and again in 54 when he was in Guatemala. They had been following him before the Cuban Revolution. These people are very conscious. They identified Che, and that's when Rostow wrote the memo to Johnson. I just want to conclude by reading a poem. This is a poem written by Victor Hugo, and it's about Jean-Paul Marat. Like Che, Jean-Paul Marat was a doctor, and he was a spokesman for and a leader of the Parisian poor during the French Revolution. They said Marat is dead. No, Marat is not dead. Put him in the pantheon or throw him in the sewer. It doesn't matter. He's back the next day. He's reborn in the man who has no job, the woman who has no bread, and the girl who has to sell her body, and the child who hasn't learned to read. He's reborn in the unheated tenement, in the wretched mattress without blankets, in the unemployed, in the proletariat, in the brothel, in the jailhouse, in your laws that show no pity, in your schools that give no future. And he reappears in all that is ignorance, and he recreates himself from all that is darkness. Oh, beware, human society. You cannot kill Marat until you have killed the misery of poverty. Viva Che. Thank you.